Hi everybody, this is a quick lecture on language and theme in Elie Wiesel's Night. I'm going to start this off with a quote first, and this is on page 6 of your text. Quote, "And then one day all foreign Jews were expelled from Siget," writes Wiesel quite bluntly, "and Moishi the beetle was a foreigner." So one of the things that I want you to consider is his use of language. And that specific quote is very blunt, direct, and quite shocking, especially when you contrast it with other parts of his book, the language that he uses. The quote that I just read, the tone is quite matter of fact, direct, blunt, and matter of fact. He doesn't use pretty imagery. He doesn't use vivid imagery. He just states the facts. So I want you to consider, what is the effect of that tone, of that matter-of-fact tone? And why do you suppose he delivers that information, that shocking information, in such a way, in such a direct, matter-of-fact way? What's the point of his abruptness? What is the point of Wiesel's abruptness in that quote and in any other text where it's matter-of-fact, it's direct? So consider, when you look at other passages, consider how the tone is portrayed in other passages. He frequently drops that matter-of-fact tone, and instead he uses vivid imagery. So then I want you to think about the effect in passages where he uses vivid imagery. What is the effect on pathos, his appeal to emotions, to you, the readers, the emotions of you? What is the appeal to ethos? How is he establishing his credibility there? Kairos. Is he saying the right thing at the right time to the right audience? And part of that saying the right thing is delivered in tone also, whether it's matter of fact, direct, blunt, or whether it's a little bit because of vivid imagery, it paints a picture with words. And is the tone happy or is it sad? Is it miserable? Is it terrifying? Is it joyous? These are all different types of tones, okay? So how do you identify tone? You look at the diction, and if you see right here, there is diction. Is it formal? Is it informal? Does he use slang? Is it pretentious? Does he use contractions? In academic writing, when you're supposed to write academically, you do not use contractions. So instead of saying I can't, you would say I cannot. And actually in academic writing, you don't use first person point of view. You don't use the I in there. Instead, you would use that third person vague point of view. One cannot, as opposed to I cannot. So is the language formal? Is the diction formal? Are contractions used? If there are contractions used, can't instead of cannot, then it's going to be leaning towards informal. Also part of diction is choice and use of words, phrases. All of those words help define help define the tone, whether it is joyous or ambiguous or terrifying. You can also look at verb tense. Is it passive verb or is it active verb? And there's an example of passive versus active. Passive, I'm going to use the generic ringing telephone. Passive voice, the ringing phone was answered by me. In that case, the emphasis is put on the phone, the ringing phone. Me answering it, that's de-emphasized because I appear at the ending of the sentence. So the ringing phone was answered by me. Active verb tense is I answered the ringing phone. The agent, me, I, is doing something. There's action. I did what? I answered the ringing phone. You can also look at sentence structure when you're identifying tone. Look at sentence structure. Is it simple? Is it complex? Or is it compound? And there are examples of the 3 types of sentences. Simple, the dog chased the cat. You have subject, verb, noun. Dog, subject, verb, chased, cat, noun. Or predicate, since it appears at the ending of the sentence. Compound, the dog chased the cat, comma, and the cat ran off. Compound, where you have 2 complete sentences joined together. But if you're going to use a comma, you have to use a conjunctive word, and. Okay? So there has to be comma, and. separating the two complete sentences. You can also use a semicolon, or you can use a period and just start a new sentence. And I believe I talk about that in a video of last week, the how to correct sentence structures, how to correct incorrect sentences. And then complex, because the cat ran off, comma, the dog chased the cat. And I put in brackets there, modifying clause. The modifying clause is because the cat ran off. Any phrase of sentence, any group of words, any phrase where it starts off with because or whether or things like that, you're probably going to have a modifying clause. You're going to have a dependent clause. Because the word because or whether automatically identifies it as a fragment, that fragment becomes a modifying clause, and it needs the rest of the sentence, the correct sentence, in this case, the dog chased the cat, to make sense. So right there, you've got three types of sentences: the simple, compound, and complex. And you can look at that, identify, when you pick a passage to write on, identify the tone. How are the sentences constructed? Are they complex, compound, or simple? And how do those types of sentences inform? How does it lead you to believe this passage tone is either horrific, one of horror, one of fear, one of terror, or one of joy, or one of bemusement, or one of confusion? Okay? So I'm going to show you a quick video clip, and it's how tone sets the mood for something. And then we're going to go back to Wiesel's Night book, okay? A lot of really creative people do some incredible stuff, like they'll cut and splice, basically edit an existing, in this case it's going to be a movie clip, an existing scenes from an existing movie. They cut and splice and edit it and rearrange them to create a completely different tone. So the example we're going to use is actually that old movie Mary Poppins. I confess I've never seen it, not even when my kid was little. I haven't seen it, but I do know it's a family movie, and the person who spliced and edited this movie turned it actually into a horror movie. And you know me, I love horror. I love to research horror. So we're going to look at how tone, and if you're like me and you haven't seen Mary Poppins yet, just go to YouTube and do a search for Mary Poppins. Whether or not you want to watch the movie, that's up to you. But you can at least see the trailer of it. And it is a family movie. It's not spooky. It's, I guess, a feel-good movie. This person who edited the scenes from Mary Poppins turned it into a horror movie. So let's watch that. And I want you to see how the tone is established by editing. Okay? And remember, editing is rearranging or cutting images, phrases, sentences, etc. to achieve that desired tone and meaning.
Stay awake, don't rest your head, don't lie down upon your bed.
Okay, so as you can tell, Chris Rule, I believe, is the one who edited that clip from Mary Poppins. The way he spliced together scenes and images, he cast a darker tone to the entire trailer, and the music he played. The music was kind of spooky sounding, very suspenseful. It changed the tone. the tone went from the original Mary Poppins, this feel-good family movie, to something spooky and horrific. So think about how images, and not just pictures like we see right here in the picture, the movie trailer, but how in this case Wiesel paints pictures with words. Think about how he splices, he creates these pictures with words, these images in your brain, and then he puts them together. In what order? Does he offset something horrific with something benign, something, that's kind of like everyday? Or does he keep ramping up the horror? There are a couple of scenes in the book where he's ramping up the horror, the horrific images. Assess the tone, how the fact that he's ramping up the horror through this series of horrific images, what kind of tone does that create to that passage? And then overall to the book. I want you to look at, I'm going to read aloud the passage so you can pull out your copy of the book, or if you have the PDF version, look at it. But I'm going to read it to you in any case. And it's the passage where the prisoner's reduced to crawling for soup before being shot during an air raid over Buna. And a couple of you talked about this in your discussion board. So some of you, I think what we're going to talk about may ring some bells in your head. And those of you who didn't discuss this specific passage in your discussion board, listen to it. And I want you to think about the tone, and then how the tone in turn translates or informs Wiesel's theme. So this appears on page 59 near the bottom. Actually, I'm going to start kind of near the middle of page 59. Fear was greater than hunger. Suddenly, we saw the door of block 37 open slightly. A man appeared, crawling snake-like in the direction of the cauldrons. Hundreds of eyes were watching his every move. Hundreds of men were crawling with him, scraping their bodies with his on the stones. All hearts trembled, but mostly with envy. He was the one who had dared. He reached the first cauldron. Hearts were pounding harder. He had succeeded. Jealousy devoured us, consumed us. We never thought to admire him. Poor hero committing suicide for a ration or two or more of soup. In our minds, he was already dead. Lying on the ground near the cauldron, he was trying to lift himself to the cauldron's rim. Either out of weakness or out of fear, he remained there, undoubtedly to muster his strength. At last he succeeded in pulling himself up to the rim. For a second, he seemed to be looking at himself in the soup, looking for his ghostly reflection there. Then, for no apparent reason, he let out a terrible scream, a death rattle such as I had never heard before, and, with open mouth, thrust his head toward the still steaming liquid. We jumped at the sound of the shot. Falling to the ground, his face stained by the soup, the man writhed a few seconds at the base of the cauldron, and then he was still. I think what makes that passage so powerful is Wiesel here, he mixes matter-of-fact tone with this budding horror, this budding horrific tone. So it starts off with fear was greater than hunger. He's stating a fact there. And the men here and the boys here, they've experienced, they know what that fear is. They've experienced this level of fear. And this is on page 59. So you've been reading what's happening to the prisoners here, the concentration camp prisoners, and how terrifying, how frightening it is. So you can empathize with them and understand, even you're safe in your home reading it, or at any rate, you're safe away from the concentration camps. You are not physically there, so you are not physically experiencing what these people have experienced. But through the images that Wiesel is painting, you can picture what's happening, and you can start to feel for Wiesel, since he is the narrator. He's talking about his experience and what he's observing. But it's still matter of fact. Fear was greater than hunger. Still a little bit matter of fact, but we get a little bit, tiny sense of urgency with the word suddenly. Suddenly, we saw the door of block 37 open slightly. So we get this little image. Now Wiesel is beginning to paint images, paint pictures with words like suddenly and slightly. And then goes back to matter of fact, a man appeared. It's a fact, a man appeared. But then within the same sentence, actually separated with that comma, we get this image, very vivid image, crawling snake-like in the direction of the cauldrons. Crawling snake-like. We don't associate men, grown men, or grown-ups with crawling, but yet here is this man. He's crawling. And then not only is he just crawling, he's crawling snake-like. So his belly is low to the ground. Probably here trying to make himself as little a target as possible. But at any rate, he is crawling snake-like, like a snake, belly low to the ground. So he is low to the ground. He's not taking up space. He's not standing up being proud. He is making himself small. So you can read further and notice the difference, the shifting tones, very subtle, but it's there, shifting tones between matter of fact to this impending horror. And the power of this passage, because there is this shifting tone, it starts, especially if you're very empathetic, your belly might start getting tighter and tighter because you know something terrible is going to happen. And you should know World War II history, not to any great extent like a historian would, but you should know about World War II and about the Holocaust and about the final solution. So this is a horrific, horrific part of history. This stuff happened. And it wasn't, puppy dogs and unicorns and rainbows. It is horrific. And some of you, the comments that I'm reading in your discussion boards, you're just appalled at how humans can do this to other humans. And yes, I'm glad you're appalled. And we should be appalled because, and as I mentioned in the previous video, last week's lecture video, this helps us to never forget, so that this won't happen again. Hopefully it won't happen again. But as you're reading this passage in Wiesel's memoir, like I said, the tone shifts between matter of fact to slightly horrific, slightly terrifying, slightly. It's not until the ending of this passage, actually the bottom of page 59, where we get this really powerful image of this man. Passage says, then for no apparent reason, he let out a terrible scream, a death rattle, such as I had never heard before. The word terrible, and then the word scream, those two are not unbiased words. Those two are not neutral words. Terrible is something, horrible. It's evokes terror. And then a scream. Think of the difference between scream, yell, and shout. They essentially mean the same thing. This, raw, guttural, explosion of sound from a person's mouth, maybe coming from their diaphragm. But scream has connotations of something horrific, something terrible, something terrifying. A shout, you could just, be calling, you see somebody who's crossing traffic and that person doesn't see a car coming, but you see that car coming and you're going, hey, stop. You're shouting. There might be that tinge of panic, but it's not necessarily terrifying the way a scream would be. A yell, you could, yell for your favorite team. You're yelling for them to, make that touchdown or to make that basket or whatever. Each one of those verbs, scream, shout, and yell, again, they essentially mean the same thing, but they have different connotations. And in that passage, that's when we really start to see that something, or it's confirmed to us that something horrible is going to happen. And then it follows, a terrible scream is followed by a death rattle. Rattle, something that reverberates, shakes. If you ever had a baby rattle, it makes that sound where it's, little ball inside a plastic, bigger ball. And the sound comes from the little ball inside reverberating against the walls. A rattle, a sound of a rattle, breathing is, the air is just reverberating in the lungs. This is a death rattle. It's not, a breathy rattle or a breathing rattle or a happy rattle. It's a death rattle. So we are being told again, even though we know something, what this man is doing, it cannot end in goodness. You know, we don't expect the Nazis to say, oh, here, have some soup. We know something terrible is going to happen. But with Wiesel going back and forth between this matter-of-fact tone and this very subtle, terrifying tone that ramps up our tension as we read, and then he starts dropping these powerful words like terrible scream, death rattle, we know something terrible is definitely going to happen. And then, you know, something surprising, we find out that the man thrusts his head toward the still steaming liquid. Now, maybe when you read it, you're like, okay, maybe he just stopped his face a little bit above it, you know, getting a warmth on his face. But because it's kind of difficult for us to imagine somebody shoving their face into hot liquid. But this man is already starving. And we realize that this man is desperate. And when you're desperate and you're afraid, you can do fearful, terrible things, terrifying things. And we realize that this man actually, with his open mouth, he thrust his head into that hot liquid, hoping to gulp as much soup as possible. Never mind the fact that he will burn his face. But right at that moment, the Nazi shot him. So we get this really, really powerful passage based on the tone, the tones, maybe conflicting tones, but it's two different tones that Wiesel interweaves quite subtly and very masterfully, that develops this larger idea, this larger what's going on here on the page that you see, the theme of that passage and the theme of the overall book. So you have to ask yourself, well, what is a theme? A theme is the author's, and I have it on the bottom right of that screen, theme is the author's comment on humanity, what the author has to say about the human race. Right here, it's not particularly comforting thought that Wiesel has to say about the human race, and one wouldn't expect him to have such a comforting comment, comforting observations on the human race, because what he experienced, what he witnessed as a boy, and then later what he devoted his life to. So you identify the theme. Again, keep in mind, remember that the theme is the author's comment on humanity. Now, authors will use an individual or a specific event or series of events, and maybe a group of individuals, not just one, but a group of individuals, to express his or her theme. And in this case, Wiesel, he is using first person, so he's talking about his experiences and then his observations of the other people that are in Auschwitz and Birkenau along with him. But based on what you're reading, based on what you've read, and based on your reflection and thinking about it, and then based on what you identify as the tone of a passage by looking at the diction, looking at the words he uses, looking at his sentence structures, looking at the connotations of the words he uses, all of those coming together will form the theme, or what you argue Wiesel is saying about the human race through young Wiesel and all the other people that he is coming across in this in his experience. So I'm going to show you one last video here, and this is actually Wiesel himself, and it's from CNN. It's about a 3 minute 30-second video, and we're going to watch it. It gives us a little bit of background information on him and what he has done and what he did, because he did die a few years ago.
He would become the most famous survivor of the Holocaust, but at the age of 15, Elie Wiesel had no fears when his family was rounded up in Hungary by the Nazis.
To the very last minute I wasn't worried. We had no idea that Auschwitz existed.
That changed when he was transported by cattle car with hundreds of others.
I knew something terrible, which was something terrifying, was in store for us.
Arrival at Auschwitz, the extermination camp. An older inmate advises him, "Tell the Germans you're 18 years old." A candidate for work, it saved his life, or what would pass as life in the death camps. Trapped in a nightmare, Wiesel sustained himself by keeping his father alive. Father and son were later taken to Buchenwald camp. Wiesel's father, Shlomo, died just weeks before the U.S. Army arrived.
All along the Allied advance, the gates swing open from German concentration camps.
This picture was taken after liberation. Wiesel is in the second level of the bunk next to the beam. He would later say he didn't recognize himself. Wiesel lamented there was no grave of his father to visit when he toured Buchenwald in 2009 with German Chancellor Merkel and President Obama.
What can I tell him? That the world has learned? I am not so sure.
Wiesel started asking questions after the war, becoming a journalist. It took years before he talked about the horrors he experienced in his book called Night, an eventual bestseller. In 1985, as he received the Congressional Gold Medal, he implored President Reagan unsuccessfully not to visit a German cemetery filled with members of the SS. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986. The humanitarian would later speak out against other atrocities on Saddam Hussein.
It's not a matter of war, it's a matter of intervention.
Darfur, Sudan.
It's a scandal that we didn't stop the bloodshed.
And on Iranian President Ahmadinejad.
I'll tell you frankly, this man is a disgrace.
He was named a messenger of peace by the United Nations, the organization founded as a result of World War II. He would ask the UN Security Council,
Why am I involved in tragic events that occur to people I have never met on the other side of ocean-sent continents? It is because I belong to a traumatized generation, haunted by the world's indifference.
The Elie Wiesel Foundation was set up to fight indifference and intolerance. In 2008, Wiesel and his foundation learned they were among the victims of financial schemer Bernard Madoff. Wiesel always said he was a writer and a teacher. He said he never spoke for all the Holocaust victims, but serves to remind nations to not let it happen again.
As a teacher, I always believe in questions. The question is, will the world ever learn? Thank you.
So what I want you to think about, questions to ask yourself, to start identifying specific images or sentence structures or anything like that to help you enter a passage so you can examine the tone and help identify the mood. That's something I didn't mention earlier, but the mood that tone establishes is what specific words or what specific ideas, what specific images. Actually, don't do ideas. Focus on the words and the images that Wiesel puts in your mind. What specific words and images struck you, in a passage? I mean, it really moved you. It was kind of like that punch in the gut, really moved you. Are those words positive, negative, or neutral? Are they positive? Do they experience or do they express joy? Is the word love, like love is a positive word. Ice cream's a positive word. A negative word is death rattle, terrible scream. The neutral word is that matter-of-fact tone. Like he's just saying, this is what happened. This man opened the door and started coming out. How do the sentence constructions, or how does the sentence construction add or detract from the overall meaning? Did you have to read something, a sentence, once or twice or maybe 3 times in order to fully understand it? Or did you have to read it a few times to confirm to you, yes, he is talking about this. He did say what I thought he said. Or were you able to pick up on it the first read through? I mentioned in an earlier lecture, play the what if. What if he had constructed that sentence a different way? What if instead of making it a simple sentence, he made it a compound sentence or a complex sentence, and vice versa? And through those questions and the answers you're coming across, you're identifying to yourself is, what mood does that passage establish? Is it a terrifying mood? Is it a haunted mood? Is it a hopeful mood? What mood does that passage establish? Now, keep in mind that because of horrible and horrific and incomprehensible nature of the Holocaust itself is often described as indescribable. In other words, that words can't be put to good use to describe what happened here. It's an indescribable moment in history. Well, if that's the case, then how do we explain texts like night? There is a movie and a book called The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. The Tattooist of Auschwitz is kind of a recent book that came out. It's about a tattooist in Auschwitz, the one who was responsible for tattooing the numbers on the incoming prisoners' forearms, or the movie Schindler's List. So if the Holocaust is indescribable, how can these texts exist? And those are just some of the texts that came to my mind readily. Isn't it contradictory then? Does the fact that many people use the term incomprehensible or unimaginable to describe the Holocaust, does that take away from the enormity of, frankly, of such evil? Does it somehow kind of make it palatable? In the sense that's like, oh, well, that happened back then. That happened 70 years ago. It wouldn't happen now. We wouldn't do that now. Are we really so sure about that? And Wiesel, he's constantly in the little video that you saw there. There are all these different events, worldwide events that are happening, and not only in the world, but here in this country too, where we have this face of evil rearing up. So the term, or using a term like incomprehensible or unimaginable, does that take away from the enormity of such evil? Or does it somehow add to it by kind of coding this event as truly nightmarish, that it's so nightmarish I don't have the words for it? I don't have the answers, but I want you to think about that. I want those questions to marinate in your brain a bit as you are identifying another passage or identifying a passage for your rhetorical analysis of Wiesel Knight's book, okay? For this summer, I'm sorry, my mind's already on summer. For this, the remainder of the semester, you're going to be doing 2 rhetorical analyses. So I want you to think about, you find one passage that you want to analyze, but also start thinking about other passages that you may be interested in analyzing, okay? As usual, if you have any questions, text me real quick and remind for short answers, email me for longer answers, or visit me during my office hours for face-to-face answers, okay? And then especially if you have a question, I answer it, we discuss, and you think of another question, visiting me during virtual office hours or during our class time in Blackboard, our set-aside class time in Blackboard, that would be really good for you to do, and we can discuss these things. Any questions or ideas you have, okay? Bye.